Thank you very much, Theo. And yeah, it gives me great pleasure. I'm Jim Mallinson. I'm the chair of the SOAS Centre for Yoga Studies, and I'm delighted to be introducing our speaker this evening, Professor Dagmar Wujastic, who, as Theo has mentioned, is an old friend of SOAS and the Centre for Yoga Studies. Dagmar is Associate Professor in History and Classics and Religious Studies at the University of Alberta in Canada. And from 2015 to 2020, she was the principal investigator of an ERC-funded project called Yogic, so all about the tangled associations between Ayurveda and yoga. And that's what she's going to talk to us about tonight. But also, you know, I'd like to say we've been on a similar path over the last 5 or 6 years, and because I also was the PI of an ERC project, as many of you will know, but Dagmar started hers a few months before me, so I've constantly been pestering her with questions about how to go about it, and I'd like to thank her publicly here. And of course, you know, our projects have got many overlaps and ways that they're interlinked and have sort of fed off one another. There's been a certain amount of symbiosis, and that's been one of the great pleasures of my work over the last few years. She'll probably mention this in her talk, but just in case she does, I'm sure she probably will. But they've got a wonderful website for her project, the Yoga website, on which you get a timeline of yoga and Ayurveda and alchemy, and these wonderful recreations of alchemical practice. You know, the actual ways that these sanskaras are performed on various substances. So I highly recommend that. You know, one other highlight, one thing I never imagined would happen, that both Dagmar and I have been immortalized in a comic as well as part of our ERC projects. We worked together on that, and the artist did a fantastic job, so do check that out as well, ERC Comics, Yogic. And yes, it just remains for me, as Theo said, questions on the Slido, please. We'll have a Q&A at the end. I'll be chairing that and look forward to that. But now I'll just hand over to Dagmar, who's going to be talking to us about alchemy and yoga, in particular alchemical methods for attaining yogic goals. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jim. I had forgotten about the comic, the cartoon. Thanks for reminding me about that. So it's a pleasure being here in this virtual space, though I do look forward to us being able to be, you know, in each other's physical presence again. I just see that I look as if I have red eyes. I don't really in real life, but this is what Zoom has chosen to give me today. So let me just start by sharing my screen and therefore my PowerPoint. Okay, and slideshow, start from first slide. So can everyone see this slide, Indian alchemy as a yogic practice? Theo says yes, good. All right, this is where I want to start. So as you can see, I changed the title a little bit from alchemy and yoga because when Theo asked me a few weeks ago about giving a talk on this, I said, oh, I'll just talk about alchemy and yoga, and I hadn't really thought it through. And the more I sort of thought about it, the less sure of myself I became. So I reformulated the title as a question, because I am still thinking about what counts as alchemy, or to use the Sanskrit term rasashastra, and what doesn't count as alchemy, and whether soteriological or yogic aims, such as we do find expressed in the early Sanskrit alchemical works, are a defining or even necessary characteristic of the discipline. And here, one of the central questions to me, at least, is whether the alchemical operations, the actual activities of alchemists, are part of a yogic path or not. So I'm going to explore this a bit in my talk today, but please don't expect any, you know, final definite answers to the question. But what I will do is I'll give a number of sort of yoga alerts whenever I introduce a relevant passage or idea from the alchemical sources. So rasashastra, I'm just going to call it rasashastra to differentiate it from, you know, Western kinds of alchemy and so on. It's its own tradition. So rasashastra historically seems to have been a fairly fringe practice. But was well known enough to have some mentions in various narrative literatures, the Jain literature, Buddhist literature, and others. And indeed, we find mention of it in Al-Biruni's 11th century Indica, where he describes the customs of the Indian peoples. And indeed parts of it, parts of rasashastra have survived into the present as a form of medical practice and a practice of pharmaceutical production. So modern professionalized and institutionalized rasashastra is a subdivision of Ayurveda, so of that's an indigenous form of Indian medicine. You can study it as part of the Ayurvedic curriculum at Indian Ayurvedic colleges or Indian universities with an Ayurveda program. So it's part of attaining the degree of BAMS, of Bachelor of Ayurvedic Medicine and Surgery. And you can then specialize in rasashastra. And I saw on the list of the people here in the audience, there are some friends who happen to have trained in this system. Priyanka, hello. So there are people who specialize in the practice of rasashastra now. So studying rasashastra gives you an official medical certification that allows you to practice in India within a certain regulatory framework. And you can see what that looks like, or what can look like on the slide on the picture on the right, which I just downloaded from the internet. So this is not my fieldwork or anything. I just downloaded from the internet just to give you an idea. So this is from the Sri Dharmasthala Manjunateshwara College of Ayurveda. And you can sort of see the nod to modernity and indeed to modern medicine with the white lab coats, but still also the use of mortar and pestle as is traditional both in Ayurveda and in rasashastra. So the fact that rasashastra still exists today in a medicalized form will play a role in my talk, and so I'll get back to that later. The picture on the left, which is from Google Arts and Culture, it's a sort of slide, which is a sort of online exhibition on Indian alchemical labs, sort of represents to me the beginning of the discipline. Patricia Southoff, who has worked on my project, wrote a blog post, which you can find on the Ayuryoga website and under the blogs, where she gives the link to the Google Arts and Culture slideshow on the Alchemical lab. So that's where you could find that if you're interested. So, but let's go to the beginning of the discipline. Oops, sorry, I'll actually stay on this. Sorry, Jim, not quite yet. But okay, so the beginning of the discipline. So in the 10th century CE of the Common Era, maybe 10th century, maybe a little bit earlier, alchemists in India began to compose works about their craft, defining both its goals and the methods with which to achieve them. And the earliest works that we know about are the Rasa Tantra, the Heart of Mercury, which dates to probably the 10th century, and the Rasayana, the Ocean of Mercury, which dates to maybe the 11th or 12th century. The latter work is probably better known than the Rasa through the work of David Gordon White and his pioneering book, The Alchemical Body. Here in this talk, I'll be focusing on the Rasa Tantra as the earliest of these Shaiva alchemical works. So this new genre of literature set practices that were previously the stuff of legend, and that's how they're described in narrative literatures, within a framework of a scientific but also soteriological discipline with formal boundaries, in other words, a Shastra. So this new Shastra was, broadly speaking, Shaiva. But we also know of Jain alchemy, which was set into more of a medical context, and indeed Buddhist alchemical antecedents, and that was what that slide was supposed to be about. There we go. Jim, I said I would use your images. So here we have it. So this is, so in Buddhist context, we have some evidence for alchemical practices in Vajrayana Buddhist milieus through the Kala Chakra Tantra and its commentary, the Vimala Prabha, but also then later echoes of alchemical knowledge in works such as the Amrita Siddhi, which you may be familiar with through the work of James Mallinson. So the Amrita Siddhi is not exactly a Buddhist work, it's a Hatha Yoga work with sort of Buddhist elements that then has gone into the Shaiva milieu. And here in these pictures, which were sent to me very kindly by Amol Bankar and James Mallinson, you can see basically this is part of a door panel where yogis are sort of shown as also having some sort of alchemical practice. At least that's what I sort of see in this. Basically on the bottom picture, and this is the picture sent to me by Amol Bankar, you can see this alchemical apparatus, which to me looks like a distillation device, maybe an Adapatana yantra. And on the top right, you see a yogi who is maybe using tongs or so to get something out of a sort of a pot that is on a stove, and actually look out for it. I will have pictures of a stove that we made for some experiments that looks a lot like this. So we have some evidence for alchemical practice, not just in Hindu context, but also in Buddhist ones and in Jain ones. So, the Buddhist ones sort of survive in the Tibetan tradition, so which developed it further and also gave it its sort of own local flavor, as it were. But back to the new literature from the 10th century, Rasashastra and so on. So this new, or perhaps I should say, newly described discipline of alchemy was both spiritual and practical. And its practitioners considered goals such as making gold, lengthening lifespan, attaining superhuman powers, siddhis, and entering transcendent states, here's my yoga alert, achievable through technical means and especially through the use of substances. Indian alchemists developed a set of procedures they believed would transform inorganic materials and also organic materials into substances with the power to transmute base metals to noble ones and ordinary humans to perfected beings. So I'm using the term alchemy to describe this discipline. The tradition itself has a range of words to refer to its practices. So here you have some of them. So these are the terms that actually occur in the Sanskrit alchemical works themselves. So we have rasashastra, the discipline of Mercury, rasa vidya, the knowledge about Mercury, Rasa Vada, the doctrine of Mercury. Sometimes you will find Indian alchemy referred to as Rasayana. That's, for example, how it occurs in Al-Biruni's Indica. So he uses Rasayana as a sort of umbrella term for the discipline. However, you don't find the use of Rasayana in the alchemical texts itself to denote the discipline as a whole. In the alchemical works, Rasayana always means a phase of practice, actually the final phase of practice in which somebody consumes the elixir and the sort of regimen associated with the consumption of the elixir. One final term used sometimes to describe the discipline is rasashastra siddhanta, but that actually only occurs in the Sarva Darshana Sangraha, so it's not a typical term you will find. So in any case, you can see a pattern here, right? Which is this discipline is obviously about Mercury, rasashastra, rasa vidya, rasa vada, unless, you know, I am terribly mistranslating the word rasa here. I don't think I am, because from the context of contents of these alchemical works, we do see that Mercury is at the center of their endeavor. Now, we know there were other comparable disciplines around that may have been kind of competitors to Mercury, to the Mercurial science. In some sense. So one of the earliest alchemical works, the Rasayana, the Ocean of Mercury, makes a specific note of them. So I've got this on a slide. This is Rasayana, chapter 1, verse 44. The doctrine of Maika Khagga Vada is the lowest doctrine. The doctrine of mineral salt is a middling doctrine. The doctrine of mantra is the highest, and the doctrine of Mercury, Rasa Vada, is the very highest. So you can get these sort of the doctrine of mica, of mineral salts, and of mantra, indeed, you know, as something that sort of belongs or can be an alternative to Rasa Vada, but Rasa Vada being the best. Now, we also know of a Loha Vada, which is a doctrine of iron, and this is mentioned in another alchemical work. We also have recipes for iron elixirs in medical works, where they're associated with the most famous Indian alchemist of all, and that's Nagarjuna. So not the Buddhist philosopher, but an expert on alchemy, who is also mentioned, for example, in Al-Biruni's 11th century description of India and its customs. So any of these doctrines could be understood as representing an alchemical tradition of sorts, as each is associated with bringing about a transformation of the material world, both of substances and the human. And that's sort of the key to what is alchemy, transmutation. I should add one more Vada, one more doctrine, and that's Tatu Vada, because our earliest mentions of some kind of alchemy, which all occur in narrative literatures, use that term, so Dhatu Vada. Dhatu stands for metals and minerals, or inorganic substances. Obviously, the categorizations used 1,000 years ago are different to the categorizations of substances that we use today. So the discipline Tatu Vada describes seems to always have been about making gold, not about the transformation of the human being. So this is the difference to the kind of alchemy described in these Shaiva alchemical sources. So in any case, it's Mercury that is at the center of the Shaiva alchemical discipline. And the earliest alchemical works tell us why in the first chapters, in the introductions. Both the Rasa Hridaya and the Rasayana start off by explaining what the aim of the discipline is. And here's again a yoga alert. Broadly, the aim is the attainment of the state of samadhi or Brahma or moksha or mukti. So all these terms sort of occur in these first chapters, or more specifically, jivan mukti, so liberation in a living body. So just to say, the word yoga doesn't really appear. That is, if you do a search for the term yoga in alchemical texts, you will get very many hits. But that's because yoga is meant usually in the sense of compound. So when you mix two substances, that is a yoga. So you don't really find it in, you know, like yoga samadhi or so. You don't get that sort of explanation. So none of these categories, you know, of samadhi, Brahma, mukti, and so on, are defined or explained in any detail. It seems to have been self-explaining or self-explanatory to the authors. So we definitely see that the alchemists were interested in soteriological aims, but they also talk about other aims such as good health, sexual stamina, fertility, youthfulness, cognitive power, and siddhis, special powers. So all of these get mentioned as well, and this even to the point where you say they're an alternative aim to liberation. The texts state that these aims can be achieved through using Mercury, and they delineate why this is the case. And they have similar takes on this with different emphases. The general argument in their introductions is that Mercury will allow you to sustain the body, which is important because you want to attain liberation while alive, well, in a living body on the one hand, and that's the point that the Rasayana makes very, very strongly. And because using Mercury will allow you to study, to turn your mind to liberation, which will then eventually lead to liberation. And that's the take that the Rasa Hridaya takes. So here it's what the Rasa Hridaya says specifically, says that holding that the enjoyments of wealth and of the body are not permanent, one should strive after liberation, and the word used is mukti, and liberation results from knowledge, knowledge from study, and study is only possible in a stable body. So what you see here is that the attainment of liberation is not directly through the use of Mercury, but sort of indirectly because you get a stable body through Mercury. Now it's worth noting that both the Rasa Hridaya and the Rasayana have a different angle on this in their final chapters, which in both cases are about taking the Mercurial elixir that has been produced over many of all the other chapters, as it were. So in these final chapters, both works describe how the intake of Mercury is what lets you attain liberation directly, rather than as a means of prolonging life to facilitate spiritual study and indirectly leading to liberation. So this is, so I just thought I'd give you an excerpt from the Rasa Hridaya Tantra from the 19th and final chapter where this is described. So this is what you get according to the Rasa Hridaya Tantra. So this is part of a Mercurial elixir regimen. So this happens over actually probably many months where you're taking this elixir. And results are sort of gradual. So here he says, the Mercury penetrates and he will produce children, radiant as divine children. He becomes invariably loved by women and free from wrinkles and gray hair. The intelligence, strength, and power of the one undergoing Rasayana, this elixir regimen, grows together with his lifespan. The divine intelligence and divine qualities of one who has attained these grow further. One who has become fully perfected through Mercury, who has left behind troubles, aging, and death, and is possessed of good qualities, continually roams all the worlds through moving in the air, through moving in the sky. This is this Kecharatvam. He will also become a giver and a creator here in the triad of worlds like the lotus-born, so like Brahma, one who maintains like Vishnu, and a destroyer like Rudra. So you can see that this particular passage isn't even sort of specifically Shiva, if you will, but in another passage you have, that you will attain Shivatvam, so the state of being like Shiva. So, but let's go back to the introductory chapters, and there the Rasa Hridaya says that you cannot achieve samadhi or mukti with a decrepit body and mind, and specifically it says one who is worn out with age and overwhelmed by afflictions such as cough, dyspnea, etc., and whose cognitive organs are obstructed is not fit for the attainment of samadhi. What I translated here is as not fit for the attainment of, basically cannot attain samadhi, so it is physically not able to attain samadhi. So what to do, and this is where Mercury then comes in. There are slightly different, or even quite big different reasons given in the Rasa Tantra and in the Rasayana. So according to the Rasayana, Mercury is Shiva's semen. It's a primordial substance of creation, and therefore the most powerful substance in the world. It's a substance that is worthy of worship, and it's really a manifestation of the absolute. So there's nothing that Mercury can't do for this particular reason. The Rasa Hridaya, the heart of Mercury, gives a slightly different explanation, which is to do with Mercury's special characteristics. So the Rasa Hridaya states, why Mercury? No potion of roots or metals that is itself unstable can be burnt, rotted, or dried up, is capable of producing its, so the body's stability. Woods and herbs are absorbed in lead, lead in tin, and tin in turn in copper, copper in silver, silver in gold, and gold in mercury, just as all beings are eternally absorbed in the supreme spirit, the king of essences, and that's Mercury, alone bestows agelessness and immortality to the body. So we see here an allusion to the concept of the emanation of the material world from a single source, which we might as well call Brahma, because that's the term used throughout the Rasa Hridaya. And this is the aspect that David Gordon White highlights, and that he projects onto the practice of the Mercurial procedures, these so-called sanskaras or rasa karman, so these operations for refining Mercury, which he sees as mimicking the creation of the world in reverse, and thus leading the practitioner to Brahma, or to the absolute, as it were. Now, I understand the passage in a different way, for the reason that the Rasa Hridaya does not really seem to associate the making of the Mercurial elixir with spiritual or meditative progression. Rather, it's only in the last phase of the alchemical process, in the taking of the elixir, that transcendence is achieved. So someone could make the elixir and someone else could take it, and only the one taking it would achieve the state of transcendence. So there's a difference between how the Rasa Hridaya and the Rasayana describe what's happening. In the Rasayana, every step is accompanied by ritual actions, using consecrations with mantras, using mandalas, invocations to deities, and so on. So none of that is present in the Rasa Hridaya. It's not even alluded to. But even so, even in the Rasayana, in the last step of the consumption of the elixir, that could still be a different person from the one making the elixir. So in the Rasayana, the alchemical operations are nevertheless, unlike in the Rasa Hridaya, part of a religious practice, as it were, because they can always be understood as part of the worship of Mercury, as a representation or manifestation of the deity, of the absolute. And indeed, the Rasayana in its first chapter sort of states this explicitly, that Mercury must be worshipped. So anything that you do with Mercury can be seen as part of this sort of worship. And we don't have this in the Rasa Hridaya. So as for the Rasa Hridaya, what I see here, so in this in these verses here with the roots and so on being unstable, is the concept that only a stable, unchangeable substance can produce stability in the body. What you want is a sthira deha, a body that is stable, that is unchanging. And Mercury here is just on the at the top of a hierarchy of substances that can either decay and rot and so on, or do not decay and rot. So note how gold is closest to Mercury. It shares this characteristic of not becoming rusty or rotting and so on. And then the other characteristic is that material can absorb another material. And so a word on absorption. So this is based on something that you can actually observe. And, you know, ideally I would be showing you a film now where a drop of liquid mercury is dropped onto some gold leaf, and then you could see the mercury sort of eating gold. What is happening is the gold is dissolving in the mercury, but sort of just visually it looks as if there's only mercury left in the end. So, you know, just Google or, you know, do a word search for gold dissolves in mercury on YouTube, and you will find a number of films that show just that. And it's sort of worth seeing because it really just makes much more clear what it is that these alchemists were describing. Okay, so, but in any case, both Rasa and Rasayana agree that using mercury is the way to go. And they delineate its benefits and linking the benefits of mercury to different stages of its processing, which leads to different conditions in mercury. And then for this, they both give a phrase that appears again and again in variations in alchemical works, later also in medical works, and indeed in works on yoga. So these verses introduce some of the technical terms of mercurial processing, and I've highlighted them here in bold. And I'll talk a little bit about this translation in a minute. These short verses also introduce some of the aims of alchemy, so things like curing disease, giving immortality, affording the power of flight, and giving liberation. So it's sort of alchemy in a nutshell, as it were. So here for this slide, I've just chosen the Rasa Tantra passage, top left, and also the Rasayana one, and the bottom left is from the Kalyana Karaka, which is a Jain medical work that dates to the 9th century. And that actually has a whole chapter on the processing of mercury for medicinal purposes. And it sort of introduces a lot of these sort of alchemical terminology that we then find in the alchemical works like the Rasa and the Rasayana. It's a little bit unsure or it's uncertain whether the Kalyana Karaka's 24th chapter was perhaps added at a later stage, but if not, this would be our sort of earliest example of sort of advanced alchemical terminology. So just a word on this. Ruth Westerby wrote to me this morning saying, you know, what about this understanding of murchita? Murchita is the word that is represented here by thickened. So the Rasa reads, you know, thickened, it cures disease, bound, it gives liberation, well killed, it makes immortal, what promotes compassion more than mercury? So thickened is actually the word murchita, and you can translate it differently. Actually, I've been sort of inconsistent in my translation here. I still can't quite decide how to deal with this. So basically, the words used in the alchemical works, these special technical terms, you first find them sort of in different contexts in Ayurveda and Ayurvedic texts where they apply actually to the human body, right? So here, murchita would be somebody who has been made to faint. David White always translates murchita, murchitva, and so on as swooned, which I don't like very much as a word, and that's just my personal preference, as it were, because it sort of makes me think of corseted ladies in Mills and Boon's novels that are fainting. I saw that in the translation of the Amrita City that Jim Mallinson and Peter Santo were using the word stunned instead. So that's certainly a possibility for describing murchita. I use thickened, and in that it's just one of the meanings of murch, to coagulate, to thicken, to become sort of not quite solid, but become thick, because that is what I was sort of expecting to see when you actually apply this particular step in the mercurial processing. I said I was inconsistent because then I say bound, which is this bandhanam, instead of saying solidified, and I say well killed. Killed is one of the technical terms, mrita, or marana sometimes is applied instead of made into ash or calcined. So I'm being a bit inconsistent here. The difference of the use of these words is whether or not you see mercury as a kind of living entity, I think. And so when I translate this for the Rasashastra, where mercury is a very special substance, but is not Shiva semen and doesn't have this sort of, living power, as it were, I think it makes sense to perhaps stay with a more descriptive kind of vocabulary, so therefore thickened and then probably solidified and then maybe calcined or made into ash. But when we're reading the Rasayana, in which Mercury is Shiva's semen and at the same time a manifestation of Shiva, it may make good sense to treat Mercury as a sort of living entity, and therefore translating thickened as stunned instead. So I like this stunned, and also killed and bound as words for the translation. So I just already mentioned that these verses occur in alchemical literature over and over again, but always in variations. The connection to yoga literature is the Amrita Siddhi, as mentioned before, which is a little bit different. So it's not exactly the same sentence. And also Mercury is replaced with Bindu. So we have a sort of an idea of Bindu there being something that is similar to Mercury. That is, Mercury is not mentioned there, but where we have Mercury in the alchemical text, we have Bindu in the Amrita Siddhi. We also find it, a version of it in the Hatha Yoga Pradipika, where Rasa Mercury is actually likened to Manas, the mind, which is also likened to Vayu, the wind, or maybe breath. That's how that sort of variation occurs. In the Rasayana, here I translated it, thickened Mercury cures disease, killed it revives itself, which is different from how it's understood in the Rasa Hridaya. Bound it lets one move in the sky. So again, we have this Kecharatvam, as does the wind. So basically here, Mercury is likened to the wind. And the versions in the yoga texts are closer to the version in the Rasayana than to the version of the Rasa Hridaya. So all alchemical works, while noting that Mercury is the best material of all, for different reasons. Also note that Mercury has a number of flaws, and these can be innate flaws, or they can be contaminants. So innate flaws would be things like that Mercury is poisonous. So all these flaws, including the toxicity of Mercury, can be addressed in a series of procedures. So as referenced here in these words in bold, and then the full potential of Mercury can be utilized. So alchemical works typically describe 16 such procedures. You have different numbers of procedures in the different works, but let's say 16, that's certainly the number given in the Rasa Hridaya. So you have 16 procedures for basically refining Mercury, getting rid of its flaws, and also refining other substances that are ancillary substances for Mercury. And then 2 further procedures, so that you then have a full count of 18 sanskaras or rasa karman altogether, where then the processed product, so you process in 16 different steps, is then applied first of all to metals to produce gold or silver, and then to humans to produce perfected beings. And these are the procedures that are called sanskara in the Rasayana and rasa karman in the Rasa Hridaya Tantra. So the largest part of alchemical works is dedicated to these procedures. This is where it's at. Basically, if you have 19 chapters, 17 of them will describe in detail how to do these alchemical operations. So this is what alchemists do. This is their practice. This is how they spend their day, basically, right? And so this is what my research has focused on the actual making part of alchemy. And so this is where I finally get to show you some pretty pictures. So there we go. We have also the Ayurveda website. So in the last years, I've been working on reconstructions of alchemical procedures as described in the Rasa Hridaya Tantra, so this 10th century heart of Mercury, in collaboration with Andrew Mason. And Andrew Mason is actually in the audience today. So hi Andrew, I saw you popping up earlier in the participant list. So Andrew has studied Ayurveda in the UK actually, and he's had sort of specialist training in rasashastra on Sri Lanka. So this is where he sort of got his training. So for this reconstruction, I translated the 2nd chapter of the Rasa Hridaya, which describes the first 8 of the sanskaras, so these mercurial operations, procedures for ridding Mercury of its flaws. And Andrew then tried to do the procedures following my translation of the text. So the idea was to see whether, firstly, could we do the procedures just following the text, the translation? And there the short answer is no, we couldn't. Andrew had to apply his sort of knowledge of procedures and also consulted quite a lot with rasashastra practitioners from India. So there was sort of a lot of conversations about, what something might mean and so on. The text is very concise and just doesn't give enough information. Well, and secondly, the aim was to sort of see whether in doing these steps, one could understand the kind of language used to describe the procedure. So this terminology of rasashastra that you saw earlier in the verses that I was reading to you. So things like, murchana as making faint or as thickening and so on. And for this, I would say we had kind of mixed results because the ways in which Mercury visibly changed in the procedures did not always correspond to the states that are evoked by the terms. So there it's also the question, did we do it right, and therefore did we see what was supposed to happen or not? This experiment took almost a year, or maybe 10 months or so. We should ask Andrew again. And quite a lot of discussion and cross-referencing with later alchemical works, and indeed with the practicing rasashastra doctors, especially about, what exactly are the substances and can we substitute them and so on. But just to note, no one uses the rasa anymore, right? So the doctors we were consulting were also extrapolating from what they were taught, often using, sort of more modern texts on rasashastra. So you can see the results of these experiments, as Jim mentioned, on the Ayurveda website. And here we have, the link to it, ayurveda.org, and we have a special we put most of these films under alchemy reconstruction. And so those are the videos. And then I always wrote an accompanying blog for each video, explaining what was happening and what the challenges were and so on. So you can see those under the blog ayurveda.org/blog. Now, we only did steps 1 to 8 because this was so much more time consuming and hard work and expensive than we thought. I should say the translation consisted of 13 verses, so a really short bit of text. So I was sort of expecting maybe a month's worth of work. But actually, as I said, it took almost a year to do this. And this partly because, the weather wasn't playing ball. There is a difference if you're doing these things in England or if you're doing them in India, obviously. But even, there were some people who were doing parallel experiments in India and they were faster. But even they took, several months. And they had helpers, so they had people they could say, now go and grind this for 20 hours and so on. Whereas, Andrew was on his own and he just had to do everything. So just to note what I said about that this is what alchemists do or did, I also meant that this is a really big job, not something you do casually, but something that takes a lot of time, a lot of physical effort, and also expertise. You kind of have to have a feel for the materials, have you ground something enough? Is the powder fine enough? And so on. So there's a lot of tacit knowledge there in the making of this that is, very important for the making. Just got a message. Let me just see if it's got some questions. Okay, maybe we'll get to the questions in a bit because I really would like to show you some more pictures and some of the things that we're going to do now. So just to say finally, is thinking of, what does an alchemist's life look like? A typical day in the life of an alchemist would be him or her, in the text it's a him, but could be a her, grinding materials, all day long. That would be sort of the day of an alchemist. So it's really difficult to decide whether what we did was actually the correct way of doing things because there were so many variables about substances and apparatuses and so on. And you can't decide because of the conciseness of the text. And also, since we didn't do all the 16 steps, we couldn't do the 17th, which would have been applying the processed mercury to a metal and making gold, or something at least that looked like gold. So the proof would have been in the pudding, and we never quite got there because it got very complicated and took so much time. And also the ingredients became really difficult for us to acquire. And also some of the interim products would have been mercury chlorides, which are very dangerous. So we didn't really want to produce those. And so the step 18 would be to take the Mercurial elixir, a human being taking that. And obviously there's no way we could have gotten that past health and safety. We don't want to poison anyone. So now we have begun a new round of experimentation. And this time we're using a much later text, sort of the Rasa Sudhakara, which is the nectar mine light of Mercury, a text that belongs to something like the 16th century and is sort of one of the late texts. So here I have a map made by Keith Cantu for the project, where he shows where the manuscripts of the Rasa Sudhakara are in archives in India. And so I count 6, 7, 8 manuscripts altogether. So you can see this was not an important work. This was a minor work, at least from the textual transmission. Nevertheless, we have a print edition and even a sort of translation into English of this work, which is useful for us to use. This work is mostly concerned with making medicines, so Mercurial products that are then used as medicines. So it's sort of partly, at least, or to a large part, it's a medical work. But it also has a concise description of all sanskaras, of all 18 Mercurial operations. And it has a full chapter on the making or faking of precious materials, gold, silver, pearls, and corals. And that's the one that we are using. And so this is different from what we find in the Rasa and the Rasayana, in that making these precious materials is no longer described as a step that tests the potency of Mercury. So if you can make gold, you can apply the elixir successfully to a human in the Rasa and so on. Rather, here it's described as a goal in itself. And the author even states several times that the product is good enough for the market. So it's a kind of like artisanal product, as it were. And I would also like to note that many of the recipes don't even contain mercury. So it kind of is apart from the usual sort of steps 1 to 18. So one might think that the author means when he says, this product is fit for the market, that the counterfeit gold or silver or whatever is convincing enough to dupe gullible buyers. But the work states elsewhere that artificial gold, and it's actually, the word is rasashastra, so gold produced from mercury, is indeed of parallel quality to real gold or gold gotten through mining, and can be used for the same purposes. So it seems that the idea is mostly real transformation or transmutation. Sometimes it just says it will take the color of gold, or it's like gold, but sometimes it said this is gold, this is silver. So the idea is still transmutation or transformation. So here are the materials, and I used this also in the beginning, but here's the materials that Andrew has gathered in preparation for these experiments. And we're going to attempt something like 10 different recipes. We're going to have to see how it goes. The last time we underestimated so much how long everything would take, but the general plan is 10 recipes from chapter 11 of the Rasa Sudhakara. And so for this, we have a similar problem. As with our experiments with the sanskaras, with the mercurial operations of the Rasa namely that the text doesn't give us very full information. The recipes are really quite short, and we have to fill in the gaps, as it were. So we started with Andrew started with a recipe for making coral, and here is the recipe. So, having carefully ground purified conch shell into a fine powder, an intelligent person, matiman, should then grind half the amount of cinnabar and quickly triturate it, grind it, with the milk of a cow that has just calved. Having formed a bead, the intelligent person should steam it in a cottonseed decoction, and after it has cooled down by itself and has been collected, it will be a bright coral. So it's this, it will be a bright coral. It's not fake coral, it's actually coral. So, a number of questions come up here. What is purified conch? Is it just washed? Is it cleansed? It's shuddha. So is it just washed, or does it undergo a method of purification, as do, materials generally in the alchemical works? So this is part of a larger question, given that none of these materials will be taken internally or be part of an elixir, as far as I can tell from reading the text. Do any of the materials need purification? Things like, purification that is aimed at detoxification or so. Nobody's going to be poisoned with this because nobody's going to be taking this internally. purification procedures, the sanskaras, are the hallmark of alchemical literature, and it really distinguishes, how physicians use materials and how alchemists use materials. So this is kind of like we kind of want to have purification, as it were, for any alchemical anything that happens within the alchemical context. Well, in the case of conch, the Rasa Prakasha Sudakara doesn't actually give any description on how to purify it. So not in this recipe, but also not in another part of the work, because in some of the other chapters you get lists of materials that will be used for making the medicines or so, and there you usually have a sentence or two on how to purify them. So there's nothing for conch in this work. But Andrew knew some methods from his training and also pointed out that it's almost impossible to grind conch to a powder as required in the recipe without using such a purification method, which actually breaks down the material. And this actually involves basically 3 hours of boiling conch in vinegar. So this is what Andrew did. And here are the nice pots that the friend of Andrew's who does pottery made for us. And you can see, so on the top left is just conch in vinegar, and then you put it on the stove, actually with a lid usually, and then you just boil it for 3 hours, and that breaks down the material. It makes it brittle, and then you can smash it up and grind it in a mortar with a pestle. So that's what's happening there. And then the next part of the recipe calls for ground cinnabar, half the amount of the conch. And so here we have some cinnabar. And here we have similar questions, right? So do we purify cinnabar for this? The recipe doesn't say purified cinnabar, but Andrew made similar arguments about, being able to grind it actually. And also I would say it's so ingrained in people who have trained in modern rasashastra that you always purify materials before using it, because you're using it, in that context as a medicine, and you don't want to poison your patients, obviously. So anyway, he did do some purification, and for that we used instructions from another chapter in the Rasa Prakasha Sudakara. This is chapter 6, which states for cinnabar that you steam it with monkey fruit or breadfruit. So you make a decoction of breadfruit inside a wax gourd, and then it becomes pure, and then you can apply it in all procedures. So that's what Andrew did, and here you could see it. So that's breadfruit, and you cut it up and you put it into water and you boil it, and you boil it down to make a decoction. And apparently this is very smelly and kind of unpleasant. If I understood Andrew right, we should ask him some questions later in the Q&A session about this. So then, you made this decoction, and then you have the wax gourd and you hollow it out, and that's where you put the cinnabar in, and you enclose it with the top half of the gourd, and then you envelop it in cloth, and you make a sort of bolus, and that bolus is then hung into this dola yantra, which is a steaming device that is used for svedanam, also for this sort of steaming step in the sanskaras. And that's where the decoction, the breadfruit decoction is, and you'd have the lid on again, but you hang it in there and then you steam it for several hours again. So I can't remember how long he did that for, but a certain amount of time, which incidentally, you keep on having to refill the decoction because you're doing it for several hours. You also have to keep on refilling the fuel for the oven. So this is it's, even though it does the thing by itself, you still have some activity that needs to be done during this process. So that's, so then you get this cinnabar that you can crush a bit more easily, if I understood Andrew correctly, and you then mix that with milk, with cow's milk, a cow that has just calved, and Andrew has some farming neighbors who could help out there, and then you get this sort of mixture of cinnabar and milk. And so that's where we are to date, or Andrew is to date. So Andrew is still grinding this. And it really bears saying again, this sort of grinding of materials, it's not something that you do within an hour, 20 hours, 30 hours, 40 hours, it really takes time to get to the point where you have this very fine powder, because the idea will be that you will then have a conch cinnabar milk paste. And so you can see on the bottom picture that, this is still far from being a fine paste. And so I'm afraid this is where we are right now with this experiment. The next thing will be to form a bead of this paste then, and that will then be steamed using also, again, a cloth and this sort of steaming device that you just saw, but this time using a cotton seed decoction. So here are cotton seeds, and you would make a decoction. You just mix them with water and boil that, and then you have the cotton seed decoction, and then you use the steaming device to make these coral beads. And I'm really sorry that we don't have, we don't have the finished product yet to show you. The weather in England here has not been playing ball. It's been rainy and cold, and so this, Andrew does this outdoors, and so he wasn't able to finish for this. But have a look on the IREO website in, let's say, 2 or maybe 3 weeks, and we'll have a blog and maybe even a film ready for you, and then we can see, did we make something that looks like coral, or did we not? Was this, a fake recipe or not? So what we have learned so far, and I'm sort of finishing up now, is that we cannot quite decide on whether or not we need the purifications, and I guess we won't quite know until we see the results. One thing is clear, this is going to be expensive. The coral recipe is not too bad. It's a bit difficult to get one's hands on breadfruit and waxwood in the UK. That might be, easier in India, where it is perhaps a seasonal recipe, I suppose. The gold and silver recipes need some serious investment in terms of materials. So the silver ones often actually have silver as part of their ingredients. We've decided that we'll make several gold ones and several silver ones. The next ones will be to make pearls from fish eyes, and also gold from lead, zinc, and copper, which I actually think is that we will be making brass, I suppose, but it should look like gold. And this brings up all sorts of questions about access to materials, and funding, also for the medieval alchemist who's sort of undertaking this. In terms of alchemy and yoga, there's no yoga alert here for sure. There's no samadhi that can be attained through this. Rather, it seems to be more like a way of making a living, perhaps. But is it alchemy? So it's a bit early to say, since we haven't been able to witness what happens. So is there a transformation or not? But at least by description in the text, it appears the author expects a transformation, an actual transmutation of materials. What before was conch and cinnabar now is coral. So, and since as I said, transformation or transmutation is the key to understanding something as alchemy, I would say, yes, this is alchemy, but it is an alchemy without transcendent aims, a non-yogic and perhaps somewhat secularized alchemy. I would note that the Rasa Prakasha Sudakara does contain a description of all sanskaras, and that includes using an elixir to attain Brahma, to attain the absolute. So there is this transcendent goal that it still remains in place, but it receives much less attention. What I would like to suggest otherwise, though, is that this 11th chapter, at least, maybe represents a kind of return to form. A return to the older alchemy of the Tatu Vada, which was about making gold and other precious substances and had not yet integrated ideas about the transformation of the human being. So a kind of pre-yogic alchemy, perhaps. Then the early Shaiva alchemical works and the works based on them represent a kind of course change or a moment of innovation, really, making a practical, metallurgical, maybe artisanal alchemical practice into a soteriological yogic discipline, sometimes with tantric elements and sometimes without. So I think I'll stop there and give you some space for questions. Thank you very much for listening. Okay, let's stop the share. Okay.
Thank you very much indeed, Tatu. It was great. So nice to have something sort of, even though we were only looking at it, but there's sort of material to think about, take right out of the text into the real world. I've got loads of questions, but there's also loads on the Slido, so I better limit myself. One that I can't help thinking about is, wrong button here. Where does the cinnabar come from? In my understanding, it has to come from China. Do you have? Is there information within the text or other? sources to
text
say
any information at all, and this is really a big question to me. So not just the cinnabar, also the liquid mercury. I mean, maybe they got cinnabar and then made liquid mercury from it, and we have recipes for that. But yeah, I mean, you know, as David White says in the Alchemical Body, you know, you have mercury basically in what is today Afghanistan, and then you have it in China. So that's probably where it came from. But it is really surprising that they use this material. You know, I was thinking of how, you know, we're trying to recreate these experiments and bringing it to England where the weather isn't quite right, and we're having trouble getting breadfruit and these various herbs and so on. And so it's sort of, this is a practice that belongs in India and is sort of local in the use of materials, but then it isn't, because its main material is not local at all. It's from somewhere else. And so this is a really big question to me, and I really can't answer it. You know, some years ago I did a book on Mercury, and this was multidisciplinary, so I had people doing Chinese alchemy and Japanese and, you know, Tibetan and so on, and we were trying to look at trade routes and so on. And what can I say, none of us found the answer to where it came from for India, you know, especially so early in the 10th century or so, you know, no idea. So sorry, I don't have a good answer for this.
Thanks. And I got one other quick question. In that that very popular verse in which was it Adha Kit Shadatam Nayet is how it is in the city. So around Mercury bestows you know, the state of being a sky rover, so being able, the ability to fly. Is more said in the text about how that works? I mean, it just makes me think of these, is it gutikas, these pills that there are later legends of yogis putting pills under their tongues and that makes them fly. Is that how it's...
You have the same pills also in the alchemical texts that are specifically for this. Yeah, I mean, you know, we can always say, oh, it's about the experience of flying, but my sense is that they actually are flying, you know, at least they think they are flying. So you know, but there's no particular discussion of this, you know. And I mean, there's the mention of the sort of flying through the three worlds. So, you know, we're talking about sort of kind of different dimensions, right? In the Triloka and the Svargam and, you know, various places that are not, you know, necessarily sort of physical places or are physical places, but can't be reached by normal human beings. So, you know, that's where you fly to. So it's, you know, I don't know, you know, I consider it as a experience. You know, a lot of these pills that they make, and even nowadays, because, you know, in the Tamil Siddha tradition, they're still making these pills, and they're used for meditation. You put them under your tongue, for example, and then you have this experience of flying. I don't know of anybody who says he saw somebody else fly. So, you know, there's still that. I think there's some field work and research to be done on the topic.
I did once meet one yogi who claimed to have seen someone fly, but that's a story for another time. Yes, as I say, I've got lots more questions, but we haven't got, well, we've got 10 or 15 minutes, but there's lots on the Slido. So I will go to the top one at the moment, which is Veena Ramphal. So if we could possibly go to her to ask the question. Hi, Veena.
I don't see the Slido, so you're going to have to read it to me.
I'm hoping there's some behind the scenes Veena can ask her question.
I can just let people.
Hi there, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Oh, hi, Dogma, thank you. I wanted to know, have you actually seen any yogis in India working with Mercury or spoken with any who do work with Mercury?
No, and so this, but I know that they do exist. You know, I've spoken with people who have spoken with yogis who have worked with Mercury. So, but for me, it's like I don't see these alchemists that I'm describing. I don't necessarily see them as yogis. I somehow feel that they're their own thing. You know, they're sort of the people who adhere to this Vada of rasa, right? So I would expect them. You know, it's like, who do you call a yogi, I suppose? Have you ever seen the film, it's quite an old film now, Ayurveda, The Art of Being?
No.
In that film, they show some people making mercurial products used for medicine, but also used for other purposes. So you can sort of see sort of some memory of this, at least in this film, which is now 20 years old or something. It's from Pan Nalin, shows some practices. There's somebody, so Brigitte Sebastia, who works or worked at least at the Institute in Pondicherry, the French Institute at Pondicherry. She has done research on Siddha, mercurial practices, and she and her husband went around Tamil Nadu, and they photographed various practitioners who make, for example, these meditation balls, including female practitioners. And so Brigitte's work, she's an actual anthropologist. I'm a philologist, I work with texts, right? But she actually went around and sort of visited people. So her work is really interesting there. She published an article in one of the books that I edited on Mercury, and you can see the pictures there, and also pictures of the practitioners that she visited, some of them, not all of them. So these people are still around. I locate them not so much into a Sanskritic milieu, but maybe into a Tamil speaking, as sort of the living practices.
Great, thank you.
Okay. So we've got at the top of the list in the slide, we've got a couple of anonymous ones. So I'll ask the first one, which is, given the dangers of mercury poisoning, what precautions do rasashastra practitioners take to ensure their safety while working with mercury? Yeah,
so they don't describe any safety precautions in the texts, right? Modern rasashastra practitioners are in laboratories, and they have the usual sort of things that people have in chemical laboratories, sort of air control and so on. But in the text, you don't have any description of the work being dangerous, which is actually where it is dangerous, because the fumes are produced sometimes through heating the mercury, which is like the worst thing. What they do describe is how to detoxify mercury. So this is part of the sanskaras, just in general. So one is the one where you triturate them, the mercury with particular materials, aloe, for example, being one of them. And that's supposed to make mercury non-poisonous. All the alchemical works do describe what if you took mercurial elixir that was not prepared properly and therefore is toxic. And then they have some medicines that you can take for that, but it's always framed as it wasn't done right, like if it's prepared in the correct way, then there should be no poisoning. So that's the take of the works, at least on this topic.
Okay, thanks. The next one, another anonymous one. In the West, alchemical and magical practices, magical with a K as well, are heavily stigmatized. What led to Rasashastra's acceptance in universities in India as a valid medical practice?
Well, I think that's a long-term development of where alchemical thought sort of enters Ayurvedic thought, and you can see this sort of play out in the literature, where some of the processing methods are sort of taken on that were first developed in alchemical milieux, and then you find them being used in for making medicines as well. And so this is a sort of slow development, and you can see sort of some alchemical work sort of moving away from all these spiritual aims to really just focusing on medicine. And so this happens over many centuries, to the point where you can't really tell a medical work and an alchemical work apart sometimes. If the alchemical work is now just focuses on medicine, you can, because the alchemical ones usually use formulations that contain mercury, but that's the only way of keeping them apart. Otherwise, they use Ayurvedic terminology and ideas about the humors and so on. So this is merging of the traditions, or some aspects of the traditions, over many centuries. And therefore, by the time Ayurveda was institutionalized in the 20th century, where you get a sort of regulatory framework about the practice and the education of Ayurveda, this was already a standard part of Ayurveda.
Okay, thanks. Next one, top of the list. We've got Matteo. If we can go to Matteo, please.
Good evening. Thank you for the fascinating presentation. Very, very intriguing. I have a quick question. I was wondering if you could please tell us a couple of words about what do you see to be the main similarities and or differences between the theories, techniques, and goals of Rasashastra, excuse me, I'm not trained in Sanskrit, and the Western alchemy, so to say. So thank you very much.
Yeah, so historically, I think there isn't much overlap. I really don't see them overlapping at all. I mean, the point where I would think they might be, if you think of the trajectory of Western alchemy, which would be something like the Greeks, then the Islamic world, and from the Islamic world to Europe. You know, the Islamic world is obviously the place where you might think there might be an overlap between, you know, Indic thought and there is, you know, you can see a little bit of what the sources used in non-Sanskritic alchemical sources, you know, but let's think of a writer like Arazi or so who's describing, you know, alchemical methods. We were looking at this for this project that I did many years ago on Mercury, and we had you know, some Arabic and Persian readers, Natalia Bashur from the University of Zurich, and she was looking at the texts and so on, and we couldn't find excuse me, we couldn't find an overlap in any of the recipes. It's just, it wasn't there, you know, and we thought, oh, this must be somewhere. And, you know, there is so much similarity, as in, for example, the use of mercury and sulfur compounds. That's like a big one that happens absolutely everywhere. Also in China, there's something in the language, you know, where we just haven't found the text, or maybe we'll never find the text, but, you know, the text that sort of explains the use of some of the language. And the one that I am particularly sort of, I really want to find the origin for this, is this description of mercury as killed. You know, mrita, this killed mercury, and you find this sort of a concept of mercury that is killed in Chinese sources and also in Arabic sources and Persian sources and so on. There's some overlap there, there's some sort of common understanding there, and we just haven't found, you know, where is the explanation for this, you know, how, in what way have they interacted? I mean, we do have interactions much later, you know, in the sort of 17th, 18th century, but not much more than that. And, you know, Europeans and Indians, I don't think there was much overlap. Nowadays, there is some, you know, modern day alchemists do communicate with Indian alchemists. So, you know, when I say alchemists in India, you know, I was talking about the institutionalized rasashastra. There is also a non-institutionalized rasashastra, Rasa Vidya, Rasa Vada, and that's a little bit harder to actually put your finger on what it is that people actually do and believe. But historically, European alchemy and Indian alchemy are completely separate as far as I can see.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to butt in, I'm afraid, it's chair's prerogative. And on that note, how about Indian and Chinese alchemy?
I know, you know, we're always like, there must be a connection, you know, it's clear that, you know, Chinese alchemy is so much older than Indian alchemy. The use especially of mercury, so the Chinese were using mercury a lot for these sort of transcendent purposes, also for making gold. And then they stop and instead use these sort of self-cultivation things and more meditation things and so on, Taoist ideas. But then, you know, when the Chinese use of mercury stops some centuries later, it sort of pops up in India. So I wonder whether, I think there might be like a Tamil connection there, a Southern Indian trade connection of ideas. And that might actually also account for mercury being sort of introduced to India. But look, you know, there's smoke, but we haven't found the fire yet exactly. So, you know, there's something more to be found out there.
Okay, thanks. Okay, we've got lots of questions. Another anonymous one. Are there places outside of alchemical texts that mention the use of mercurial medicines?
Yes. But I'm no specialist on this, but there's, you know, in sort of tantric literature, you know, it's like, it's, you know, you see any sort of category of that, but yes, there is a mention of that. And of course, in yoga literature, James, you were mentioning earlier, you know, the pills, the Kechara Guttika and so on. So in the Kechari Vidya, for example, you have this Rasayana section where you have a mercurial that is being used and so on. So you can find it in those contexts as well.
Okay, thank you. There's a question from Lubomir on Drachka, I presume. Can we go to him? Is that possible?
Hi, Lubomir.
If I can.
Yeah, I'm unmuted. Yeah. So, hello, Dagmar. Thanks for your nice talk. You mentioned physical immortality as one among the goals of rasashastra, and I wonder how prominent was this goal among all the goals of rasashastra. So, do you think that it was quite important one, or rather minor one, or byproduct, or what can you say about this? Thank you.
Really important one. What is a little bit unclear is whether this immortality is necessarily combined with liberation. So you might just be immortal but not liberated or something. So it's basically what you will find very, very often is you have a recipe for something, for, you know, like a pill or something, and then it says, what does this pill do? So very often it will, the phrase comes, he will live as long as the moon and the stars and the sun and so on. And you very often have this phrase of, so this pill gives you youth and immortality. And so this is often in the context of Rasayana, so which in the alchemical text is this elixir regimen. So you're taking a Mercury product over a certain amount of time, and then that has effects. And so this is a link to medicine, actually. So in medicine, we have this Rasayana, which is rejuvenation or revitalization therapy. And there you have the phrase, you will have youthfulness and a long lifespan, ayus. You know, you have ayus instead, and so this ayus is replaced in the alchemical text with deathlessness, or with, you know, immortality. And it's, of course, you know, are they just, you know, is this hyperbole, or, you know, just actually just living a very long time or not? It's hard to say, but, you know, you live as long as the sun and the stars and so on. So there is certainly something that, you know, within thinking of cyclical concept of time, within one cycle of time, you would be immortal, I suppose, is the idea. And that occurs really, really often. You have it in the Rasa Hridaya, you have it in the Rasanava, you have it in the Rasa Ratnakara. So it's really everywhere. And then it fades away in the alchemical works that focus more on medicine. So then you get a little bit more, you know, careful. You know, then we're back to long life.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, well, actually, this next question sort of rather flows on from that, or what you said at the end. It's an anonymous one. How do the recipes change over time? You said the Rasa Tantra is an older text. Yeah. Do later ones introduce new recipes for the sanskaras, or do they build on the Rasa Hridaya?
So, you know, we can speak of a sort of corpus of alchemical literature, because the newer works always, use the older ones. So you have a lot of intertextuality in that way. So a lot of the things that are described in the Rasa Hridaya then reappear in later texts, same for the Rasarnava. So the Rasa Ratna Samuchaya, for example, is sort of a mixture of those, and then some of the later ones that appear. So many recipes just reoccur, sometimes they're renamed, and then new recipes are sort of introduced. And it's really more about how the works are organized, you know. So Rasa Hridaya and Rasarnava, they have, you know, they're kind of linear in some sense, in a very un-Indian way, I feel. So you get sort of the start is, why are we doing this? How are we going to do this? And then, you know, steps 1 to 18, more or less, in chapter by chapter. It's not exactly like that, but, you know, you get a sort of sense of progression throughout the work that is sort of paralleled with the work, with the final things that happen in the last chapter. But later works have, you know, they're much more compilatory. So you have a bit of this and a bit of that. And yes, you have the sanskaras described in one chapter, but maybe you have another chapter that is all about making medicines against gout or something, or against cough or so. And a chapter like I showed you in the Rasa Precautions, Sudakara, where it's all about making gold and so on. So it's the organization of ideas that changes more than in a sense, the ideas themselves, you know. So a lot of the recipes from the Rasa Prakasha Sudakara, you can find them in older works, for example, but it's put into a different chapter. So that's sort of where the main innovation takes place. And well, you know, when it comes to all the medical formulations, you know, they're added. So you just get more and more and more formulations that are supposed to have medical efficacy, especially, you know, it starts with the Rasendra Chudamani 13th century, but it becomes really prominent in the Rasaratna Samuchaya, which is somewhere between 13th and 15th, or maybe even 16th century.
Okay, great, thanks. We've kind of running out of time. We have one more question, perhaps, anonymous one. Okay, with you, you haven't got to dash off. It's a different time with you.
No, it's morning. It's noon for me, so I'm completely fine. Yeah.
Is there no play on the polysemy of rasa suspected in the text, either, you know, many different meanings?
Yeah, I've been asked that a number of times, you know, when I was saying, oh, maybe I'm totally mistranslating, you know, rasashastra and so on. You know, you could always understand rasa as, you know, an essence. So it's like the shastra of essences, the most important thing, the powerful bit of any substance. And, you know, you can make an argument for that, because indeed, you know, it's not just mercury that is being processed, it's also the other materials. But then essence then is usually called sattva. instead of rasa. So no, I do think they do mean Mercury. And you know, since also these things still exist today, there's an unbroken tradition of using rasa, in other words, Mercury, you know, through medicine and so on. I think there's not that much doubt about rasa being Mercury.
Great, thanks. Well, we were wondering, well, we'd like to say thank you very much to you, of course, but also Andrew, if he wants to say hello. Anyway, much appreciative
Andrew,
of his hard work.
hello. Andrew, please come. Can you let Andrew have a word and just say what he's doing right now?
Say hi, Andrew.
I'm not really. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Yes.
Come on, Andrew. Put on your camera.
Oh my God, no. So we're just kind of battling our way through. We've picked 10 from this book, and of the 10, 6 are really quite doable. The other 4 we're going to just see how we do. But like Dagmar was saying, it's one of those things where we kind of bitten off more than we could chew, really, the first time. I wasn't thinking it was going to be as complicated as it was, and it just kind of got more and more complicated. So I suspect the same will happen with this. But you know, slowly, catchy monkey. I mean, we'll get there in the end. So I'm optimistic to see whether we get red coral. That would be really good. That would be a great start for me. If the first one works, then that's going to be a good sign. The next one will be pearl, which Dagmar said is from the fish eyes, which is kind of interesting. And the most of the other ones are going to be more metallic, so it's going to be more high temperature work, casting at high temperature and really putting things into the mix. But the big problem we're having is really deciding whether we should purify these or not, because if you purify, then it immediately, the time quadruples, because the purification is going to take way longer than actually actually doing the final mix. So that's the big thing that we're trying to decide at the moment. I mean, I'm not trained in these texts. I'm not like you guys. I don't have that background, so I can only just do what I saw when I was working in the pharmacies and know that everything's purified. But this is where I have to leave it to you to do the textual work and try and figure out what's what.
Great. Thank you very much.
Procedure. Sorry.
Will you make sure that the Centre for Yoga Studies is the first to know if you successfully create gold? We need the recipe.
we could do with it, yeah.
We have all of our universities, huh? Yeah.
Okay, well, I think it's for us to say thank you very much indeed to Dagmar. I highly recommend having a look at the website, the iYoga website as well for more. And this has been recorded and will be made available on. Someone's asked, it's on the SOAS Centre for Yoga Studies